When Putin came over in 2000, admittedly under some pretty obscure circumstances, as we've seen in Ukraine, he made war on the people. It was absolutely devastating what he did. He, right from the outset, was making certain he removed any internal obstacles to his path, and from the very beginning had design on creating a greater Russia. That's what he is about, and he
Hmm.
has those goals. And I think we should take him seriously. He has a friend over in the Indo-Pacific region who's been threatening war now for years, in President Xi, and I think we should take him seriously as well, and use Putin as an example of why a dictator who has military might and aspirational goals and keeps repeating those goals, we should likely take them seriously.
US politicians are divided over funds for Ukraine, with many Republicans arguing money could be better spent on domestic issues. Well, let's speak to General Jack Keane, who's a retired four-star general and former Vice Chief of Staff of the US Army. General, hello and good evening to you.
Yeah. Good evening, Henry.
Hi. How pleased are you and how pleased is the military community to see President Zelensky back in the US Capitol saying, hey, we want more from you? It's great so far, but it's not enough.
Yeah, certainly. He wanted the meeting with President Biden. I'm delighted the president permitted that to happen. You know, they were both at the UN General Assembly in New York City, which is the principal reason why President Zelensky came to the United States. But certainly, listen, where Ukraine is today in the second year of the war, conducting a counteroffensive, no one would have imagined that when we look back in February, when everyone, to include myself, thought that the Russians at some point would have their way with the Ukrainians and they would largely be able to take a significant amount of territory. So the Ukrainians now have 83% of their territory under their control. They have destroyed over half of the Russians' combat forces in doing so. And they're seeking assistance from the United States and coalition partners, obviously members of NATO, members of the EU, and others. And Zelensky knows full well that he owes where he is in this war to the support that he has received externally from the United States, NATO, and European countries. That's a fact. But he also knows he cannot continue to succeed unless, one, that support continues, and two, he also wants to get more advanced weapons, particularly the Army's tactical missile system, the United States Army, that is, that goes 200 miles, over 300 plus kilometers, and also F-16s as soon as possible. This is a fourth generation fighter aircraft. So those are issues that are on the table, but also certainly a big thank you to President Biden for helping to lead the coalition that has been so significant in supporting him.
How ready will the US be to give him what he wants, given some of the tensions on Capitol Hill, some of the voices that are getting louder and louder, and of course, looming on the horizon, the threat of a second Trump presidency, which would surely kibosh all of this?
Well, the overwhelming majority of Americans in credible polls, the Reagan Institute poll and Gallup, both put support for the war in Ukraine somewhere around in the high 50s, low 60s. The Senate has bipartisan support for Ukraine. In the House of Representatives is where the opposition is. Inside the Republican Party, Democrats overwhelmingly support it. Most of the Republicans do. But like many minorities, it's very vocal. So it gets quite a bit of attention to it. I do think the support for Ukraine at the end of the day will continue. And it's $24 billion that is on the table that President Biden wants the Congress to approve. And it's caught up in some other political issues here in the United States that it's tied to, not the least of which is funding the government beyond September the 30th. But I do think the support will be there, and it will continue, to be argued whether we should continue to support Ukraine. What I tell the American people through radio and television is that this is a heck of a return on our investment.
Really,
We
how
spent,
so? Because I mean, I listen to voices from across the political spectrum, and those on the right, and some of them on the far right, you might say, think there is a very poor return on U.S. investment. Why should your tax dollars be spent on saving Ukraine? We have nothing to do with them. You know, we've got so many problems at home. You know, and this is a bottomless pit. And in fact, let me just say this: the president has just announced that significant, in quotes, new military aid package worth $325 million. That's £264 million. Although it's not going to include the Army tactical missile systems.
well, that certainly is a huge plus. But to get to your
Yeah,
question, listen, we underestimated Putin for years. He told us that he wants to bring back into the Russian Federation Eastern European countries. Most of all of them are in NATO, and the centerpiece for that was Ukraine. And we dismissed him. And here he is taking Ukraine by force, an independent democratic country. Most of us who look at this clear eyed see that Putin hasn't given up his aspirational goals to take control of NATO nations, the most vulnerable being likely the Baltic states, which would mean war with NATO. And yet here we have an opportunity to stop him in Ukraine. And what we need to do is provide NATO munitions and weapons to do it, but we don't have to provide any NATO troops. That to me is an incredible return on investment. After all, the forces we have on the border, NATO forces, and and the defense budgets we have in the countries in Europe and the United States, part of that has to deal with the threat of Russia. And here we have the Ukrainians doing the fighting for us. So I think that's number one. Number two, when I look at the budget in the United States, which is a staggering sum of money, $6.6 trillion. It's hard to get your head around that number. And the total money that we have put into Ukraine, that is military equipment, humanitarian assistance financially, economic assistance financially, is $100 billion. That's a little over 1% of that budget. And if you look at this budget, I'm sure you have issues to look at your own
sure.
and see what we spend the money on. I mean, we throw money away in this country on things that just the American people look at and scratch their head and say, why are we spending money on something like that? Look what we're getting for that sum of money. Listen, $100 billion is a lot of money. But compared to the federal budget that we have, it's a heck of a return on the investment. To stop Putin cold right there in his tracks is what we're getting for
What
him.
about this issue that I read a lot online, not just social media, but in articles, sometimes by sober commentators? And just as you say that Putin betrayed a promise he made not to attack, not to invade any of these countries to his west, people always dig up the promise that your former Secretary of State, James A. Baker, made to former General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev during that meeting in February 1990, when they agreed that NATO would not extend past the territory of East Germany. How solemn was that promise, and how far was it broken?
Well, I mean, it, it was certainly broken by subsequent leaders in the United States and also in Europe when the Eastern European countries, having lived under the domicile of the Soviet Union, wanted to join NATO because they lived in that communist state, and they knew full well that they would eventually would be coming for them. Even though at the time in the 90s, democracy was supposedly breaking out all over, they didn't trust that, and they knew that their future would be in jeopardy. And I think we did the right thing. The United States, the UK, and other countries listened to them. It made sense, and we brought them in under the umbrella. I think it actually was the right thing to do. And if we hadn't, we would have likely seen something like this taking place in the Baltics or possibly in Poland as well.
But you see that it set off a ticking time bomb, didn't it, with Putin? Because he could always refer back to that meeting in 1990 and say, you broke your word, so you can't hold me to anything. And that's what he said, in fact, at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, didn't he? He said, "What happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact?" I'm quoting him directly.
Well, listen, when Putin came over in 2000, admittedly under some pretty obscure circumstances, likely responsible for the KGB bombings in the apartment buildings that supposedly the Chechens were doing, but the fingerprints were on the KGB and ushered him in. And then he immediately begins to go down and slaughter the Chechens. Now, I understand in his mind they were terrorists, but as we've seen in Ukraine, he made war on the people. It was absolutely devastating what he did. He right from the outset was making certain he removed any internal obstacles to his path, and from the very beginning had designed on creating a greater Russia, the Russian Empire, not the Soviet Union. He thinks that's a flawed system, but that's what he is about, and he
Mhm.
has those goals. And I think we should take him seriously. He has a friend over in the Indo-Pacific region who's been threatening war now for years, in President Xi, and I think we should take him seriously as well, and use Putin as an example of why a dictator who has military might and aspirational goals and keeps repeating those goals, we should likely take them seriously.